My name is Bob Liff, and this is the CUNY Forum, a town meeting that brings prominent New Yorkers together with faculty and students of the Edward T. Rogowsky Internship Program in Government and Public Affairs. We New Yorkers can be a grumpy lot, and a recent People's Pulse survey of 3,000 New Yorkers by the Five Borough Institute and other organizations found high levels of concern about affordability, the mental health crisis, and public safety. Yet by many measures, the city is actually doing pretty well. We have a record number of jobs, adding 86,000 in the year ending last November. Our unemployment rate has dropped to 5.5%. Our labor force participation is at its highest level since 1976, and our population continues to grow, now at around 8.5 million. And crime has continued to drop, down 3% year over year, and even down 5 points in the subways, though the traumas we all see on our daily commutes might belie those improved statistics. The one area where the reality may be worse than the perception is in affordability. Both the continuing housing crisis, where shortfalls have driven rents astronomically beyond the reach of the average family, and food prices are up, with the likelihood tariffs and other policies from Washington don't hold out the prospects of quick improvement. We're here to discuss those perceptions and realities at a time when New Yorkers are getting ready to go to the polls to choose a new mayor, with 4 New Yorkers who study, analyze, and report on the state of the city. Grace Rauh is the executive director of the Five Borough Institute, which was the lead organization in preparing and disseminating the People's Pulse. Jocelynne Rainey is the CEO of Brooklyn.org, another organization taking part in the survey, which champions support for groups serving the borough I grew up in. James Rodriguez is an assistant professor of urban studies at the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies. And Alyssa Katz is the executive editor at TheCITY.nyc, arguably the city's most thorough source of local news. If you do not read it every day, you should. Grace, let me start with you. This is not a survey. This is not a voter survey. It's not a voter preference survey. It's an issue survey. What are the top lines?
Thank you, Bob. Thanks for bringing us all together to dig into the survey. The top line, the headline for us is affordability, right? We saw in our results the challenge of affordability, the high cost of housing, and the high cost of basics. We're talking food, clothing, medical care, is hitting such a wide swath of New Yorkers. At the same time, I want to mention that mental health and public safety also loomed large in our results. So a vast majority of New Yorkers, over 80%, think that the city is experiencing a mental health crisis right now. We talked to people who were part of our survey about the types of interventions that they want to see. We can dig into that a little bit. And then public safety concerns as well emerged as a major area of concern, with about 50% of New Yorkers saying they feel less safe today than they did 5 years ago. But just to dwell on the affordability piece for a minute, what was so striking to us and to our pollster, we worked with Slingshot Strategies to conduct this poll, was that in years past, when you survey New Yorkers about the issues of concern to them, things like public transportation, the quality of their child's public school, their neighborhood, parks, libraries, also emerge as kind of hot button issues that are of value to New Yorkers. And we saw many of those things, while still important, really receding into the background because the affordability challenges so many New Yorkers are facing right now are just so big. And unlike public safety, where people told us in many cases that they are changing their behavior to make themselves feel safer, not riding on the subway at certain times of day or avoiding certain public areas out of safety concerns, there's very little that they can do on the affordability front. And so one of the most, frankly, disheartening figures in the study had to do with the number of New Yorkers, about 50%, who told us that they have considered leaving the city. And when we asked those folks who have considered leaving the city why, affordability was not just the number one reason, but really the number 1 and 2. High cost of housing, overwhelmingly number 1, followed by the high cost of basics, food, necessities, where people feel like they have no other option but to look elsewhere.
Jocelynne, even in a city with a $112 billion budget or whatever it is, and a state budget that's huge, governments can't do it all. And governments, central governments are pretty far from the neighborhoods. And, you do a lot of work working with community groups, training them, helping them, coordinating. With the Trump administration, we can expect less and less and less help. Is this a depressing development? Or do we just have to, saddle up and go at it?
Yeah, I think that's Brooklyn Org is a foundation that is focused on Brooklyn and racial justice in Brooklyn and funding nonprofits that are doing the work on the ground to keep people stable, to really be able to support in the areas that we found within the People's Pulse, right? Like nonprofits are the lifeline for many, many New Yorkers. And I am really proud that not only I and Brooklyn Org, but also 3 other foundations in the city helped to commission this poll, because we really want to deeply understand what communities are grappling with, so that when we're thinking about where our funding should go, that we're able to share with our donors and other foundations. These are the issues that people are struggling with. This is what they're looking for.
You also see affordability as Grace said.
Affordability, affordability is the through line to so much, right? Because not only are the folks like you and I struggling with affordability, the nonprofits that actually serve them, that help to keep them stable, are struggling. Already we're struggling with affordability before the Trump administration came on board. And we knew that, inflation made the cost of everything higher. And we had nonprofits that were actually doing food pantries and serving folks, saying that they had to cut their services in half. When the immigration, when our new neighbors migrated in, there were nonprofits that had to go from every day to every other day in order to be able to serve people. That means that every other day somebody wasn't being served. So back to your question about, today and the Trump administration and all these cuts that, frankly, I heard someone say the other day, and I thought that it was so profound. Like, people will die because of the cuts to health, to health services. People will die because of that. And so many nonprofits are going to be that bridge between people and services that they're going to need even more now. And it's going to be really hard for foundations and other donors to close that gap. But what we have to do is continue to tell the story, continue to have the real data in order to bring all New Yorkers together. So at the foundation, at Brooklyn Org, we think of all of our work as like neighbors helping neighbors. Brooklyn backs Brooklyn. And so how do we make sure that our neighbors have the information, have the intel, have the data in order to make the decisions that they need to make in order to support their neighbors? So no, I don't think we just throw up our hands, but I think that we need to be honest about the fact that the government is a huge funder of work, and that we want to, our goal is how do we cast a wider net? How do we do more? But is more going to be enough? And that's why we came together to do this, so that we can bring other folks along. And we are also so grateful for this opportunity to talk about this work, because, we want Brooklynites, and we want all of New Yorkers to understand that we're in a crisis. It is an affordability crisis. I believe it's a mental health crisis. Many of the nonprofits that I work with believe that there's a crisis as well. And, part of the survey was that folks are struggling so much and may think about leaving New York City, but they can't even afford to leave. So we have to build something here where people can be sustained.
James, you grew up in a Nycha development in the Lower East Side. I grew up in a Nycha development in East New York, Brooklyn. Public housing, when I grew up in the 50s and 60s, was kind of the engine for providing affordable housing for people. Then it shifted to this, to kind of Mitchell Lamas, a variety of ways that you tried to provide affordable housing. Now we're trying to do inclusionary housing, where you want to build a market rate development, you have to include affordable units. Analyze this. Where are we? I mean, is there a path out of this affordability crisis?
Yeah, Bob, it's a great question. And I think there's a path, and you started us on it, talking about public housing. And I love how you termed public housing as an engine. And in many ways, we can still think about it as an engine. And it's an old engine from the 50s, but it's a classic. And it may need a little bit of love and attention, and by that we mean investment of public dollars. We do need more resident-centered leadership in the housing authority. But if we're talking about the affordability crisis, as the survey points out, as New Yorkers every day in the city are struggling with and seeing the fallout from, public housing is a policy program that is perfectly suited to addressing the most acute aspects of the housing crisis that we are facing as a city as a whole right now. And it's unfortunate that we are in a position that we are advocating as residents, as organizers, to save public housing, to preserve public housing, when in fact we actually should be thinking about expanding public housing and using this as a vehicle to provide truly affordable housing that can actually meet the needs of working class New Yorkers.
I want to get back to that in a minute, but it's an election year, Alyssa. Even though this was not a survey of voters, clearly, if you want to get elected, you got to pay attention to what people are talking about.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the results of this survey, really struck me, first of all, as a kind of referendum on Eric Adams, right? He's been the mayor since 2022. Obviously, he came into office during a challenging period where the city's recovering from the COVID shutdowns, the human toll, the disruptions to the economy, to education. So we do have to keep that in mind. But a couple of themes that I think really came out strongly just as a referendum on Adams. One is that he ran on public safety, right? He's the former NYPD officer who said, I can be for public safety and racial justice all at the same time. He kind of came in following the mass movement, following the death of George Floyd. And, he clearly, when you look at these results, New Yorkers do not feel safe. And even though, as you were alluding to, Bob, I think that some of the trends in the actual crime statistics are somewhat favorable, people's own perceptions of public safety are very, very poor.
Well, in politics, perception is reality.
That's absolutely right. And so, there were slightly different, there's some questions in the survey that get at whether people felt safe generally or unsafe, how they felt on the subways, also in their own neighborhoods. And it seemed like neighborhood perceptions were maybe perhaps even a little better than perceptions on the whole.
Neighborhood perceptions, and I want everybody to jump in on this. It was very interesting that, there was a doom and gloom quality to the findings, but yet people said
They like
love
their
their
neighborhood.
neighborhoods.
like their
love their
neighborhood.
neighborhoods.
It's sort of like that, the stats where people always don't like anybody in Congress, but they
Except
like
their
their
own.
That's what it reminded me
representative.
of.
So that was a silver lining for many of us, this idea that people take pride in and are generally happy and feel good about their specific
individual
neighborhood. I think it's more the discomfort when they are venturing further out where it feels like there is more disorder, more concerns about safety.
And I do think that's partly a reflection, again, of the post-COVID environment. People came within their households and then within their neighborhoods when they did venture out. And I think that what we've seen now, going back to the election theme, is very much like we haven't had necessarily the leadership, maybe one way to look at it, where we've really all come together as New Yorkers around a sense, because another thing that comes up in the survey is a real sense of pessimism. There's a question that gets at, it's a bunch of different, are they adjectives? I'm an editor, I should know this, right? But different words, like there were words in there like, some options like hope and optimism, but most of the options were quite negative. And people overwhelmingly chose those very negative words about, people can fill me in about what.
Right, how they feel, it was, around how they feel about the city.
Yeah,
in
very,
this
very,
moment.
very
But,
negative
yeah.
sentiment. And so that really struck me. There's a lot of pessimism out there among the electorate. One other thing I'll say relating to what you were saying about housing and public housing, there was a couple of questions that drilled into people's preferences around housing policy. And the sort of current priority of the Adams administration, which is city of yes, let's use zoning and development to really drive housing opportunity, got the lowest rating of any of the options offered on this survey. People seem very skeptical of that.
Yeah, but no, but I'm just saying, Eric Adams doesn't have, no mayor has an unlimited pot of money. And, what the city of yes, essentially the core of it is that if you want to, we'll give you a 20% bonus. You could build 20% more apartments if you make those if you make those affordable, you need to play the cards you're dealt. And when in the 1950s in Linden houses where I lived, I went back and looked at it at one point. Nycha alone, Housing Authority alone, 15,000 units a year. By the time Reagan comes in the 1980s, 500 units a year. And it hasn't gotten, in terms of a standalone Nycha development, you haven't seen that return. So you got to play the cards you're dealt.
Absolutely. I think you do have to play the cards you're dealt, but I think the perspective that I take, that a lot of residents and resident organizers take, is that maybe this deck can actually be reshuffled a little bit, especially on the local and on the state levels. And so it's certainly
Well, you better do it on the local and the state
Sure,
level.
exactly,
Right
because the
now.
federal government's not going to do it, and now especially not. But that's also not been a new context for public housing. The federal government has been pretty unkind to Section 9 public housing for a lot longer than just this administration or Trump's first administration either. And so what a lot of advocates and organizers on the ground and resident leaders have been pushing for on the city and on the state level is, let's take a look at these local budgets and actually see where and how we can put this money into truly affordable housing. Because to your point, Bob, we are actually quite adept at finding different ways of subsidizing private development, even when it's with concessions to affordability. We are doing that on the local and on the state levels quite robustly, but we don't keep that same energy for public housing. And for residents and resident organizers, we're left to ask ourselves why. There is really no reason other than political will.
One quick point just to jump in on City of Yes. My organization was very supportive of the City of Yes zoning changes to allow for more housing. And I think the survey, we did ask like a standalone question on City of Yes, and it was when people were asked how you feel about this specific suite of changes, there was broad support for it. But I agree with Alyssa's point that in a broader menu, it was somewhat more mixed. But I think the housing piece is so essential, and frankly, from where we sit at the Five Borough Institute, while we applauded City of Yes, it is still very limited in terms of the anticipated outcome from housing production. And we saw how much energy and sort of political will was expended to get that over the finish line. And it's only projected to help create about 80,000 units.
And we have, what, a 500,000 shortfall?
Yes.
Right.
Yes. So just to contextualize some of that, I think one of the things that is concerning on the high cost of housing is just these sort of longer timelines that we are looking at to grow the supply of housing in New York. The idea, of course, is that when there's more supply, that will help drive down prices.
Jocelynne, you mentioned migrants, the arrival of migrants. I mean, I think what the Trump administration is doing in terms of, dragging people off the streets and sending them to Louisiana and
El Salvador.
And to El Salvador, people who have green cards. I mean, this is not just criminal, undocumented people, which is what they said they were going to be doing. The arrival of the migrants put immense pressure on exactly the kinds of, in the financials of housing, for instance, but a whole range of other social services. And, this is a city of tolerance. This is, we're a city, there's no first-class subway cars.
No.
We're all thrown together every
We all live in
every
Bed-Stuy
morning.
together. 2 doors down, there's a millionaire. We all live together in New York, and that's the wonderful thing about New York.
But, because of the immigration, because of both the migrants, I mean, what other city could handle 200,000 migrants arriving? For all the problems, we handled it because that's who we are. And I mean, is there a wedge being driven on a local level in Brooklyn? I mean, Brooklyn, Queens, always hurts me to say this as a Brooklyn chauvinist, but Queens is even more diverse than Brooklyn.
Yep.
So, but I mean, are there wedges being driven? Do you see signs of that, or are people sticking together?
I think that what we saw in the poll, and what I was so impressed with by the poll, it was so affirming to what we see and we heard through our listening tours that we were doing in Brooklyn around, first, that people love their neighborhoods. Second, that people are just so compassionate when it comes to others. And when they talked about the migrants, what they talked about was them getting their working certification so they can actually work, right? So no one was like, let's send them back. But we feel the pressure, right? We feel the pressure of what's happening. And like you said, it put pressure on all of our systems. It meant that, you weren't able to get your doctor's appointments because you're adding more people. It meant that the shelter system wasn't able to serve people that they were normally able to serve. It's pressure on our housing. But overall, what we heard in the poll was that folks feel like, let's get them into our system, let's integrate them the right way. No one was saying, oh, this is horrible, the way that, the new administration talks about migrants. Folks are like, they're here, we have jobs, let's figure this out so they can get up on their feet. But there's so many other pieces that are holding back migrants in Brooklyn. And what we've heard from community is that there's dialects you think about in El Salvador or in Honduras, you think that everyone speaks Spanish, but they're actually speaking other languages indigenous languages that no one knows. So when you see folks who are on the subway passing out candy and you're wondering why the children aren't going to school, because we don't have anyone who can speak those languages and they're very disconnected. But the beautiful thing about nonprofits is that there are mutual aid organizations that are from those communities that are supporting those folks as well, and that's why it's so important that we have that through line of support to our neighbors, because these are the things that are needed. And also when it comes to housing and affordability, and I'm thinking about a few things, and I have a question, is that the infrastructure of Nycha, it's there's real issues. Right? There are families that are really struggling, and there are stoves that aren't working, and what are we thinking about that? And then I also, from talking to communities, I think that some of the distrust comes from the fact that the previous policies around affordability and creating affordable houses didn't work. And so we've been building for a really long time in New York City. There's quite a bit of development going on. What is happening to all those houses? I will tell you that New Yorkers in general, or Brooklynites in general, don't believe that there's an inventory issue. It's just strictly a market price issue, and that we don't want to make things affordable. And going back to the People's Pulse, this is every socioeconomic demographic that is feeling this push. It is not just those that are the most marginalized.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think public housing residents would be the first to tell you that Nycha's got some issues, and those repair issues, to your point, Jocelynne, earlier around cuts to healthcare and that being literally life and death, those are the same types of issues that in the most dire conditions in public housing folks are facing, with public health issues around mold and lead exposure that can quite literally be life-changing or fatal for residents. And so certainly there's much that needs to be done at the Public Housing Authority and in our public housing communities across New York City. And that being said, it's those residents that are making that push, that are advocating for those repairs to come through public housing. And I think what we've seen instead is a real agenda around a different policy solution in public housing, one that is trying to bring private management into public housing, trying to convert public housing into Section 8 vouchers, which, to Bob's point earlier, now under our latest administration federally is now under attack, which was something that local electeds had seemed to not be feasible in the past, is now under threat. So I think all of these conditions are really coming to bear on public housing residents, and in public housing where certainly that infrastructure needs to be supported, but I think we can do that most directly by funding those repairs.
As a kid who grew up in public housing, public housing, and I want to turn to you on a political question. Public housing was intended as flow-through housing, as temporary housing. Mm-hmm. You get yourself up, you get yourself together as a family, you move into public housing, and then as you economically move up, you move on. Because of the economic stresses, people are not leaving public housing. Where are they going to go? I mean, probably, what is this, 200,000 Nycha apartments alone? It's a city of 600,000 people. But you also have the kinds of things they're talking about take money. And when you look at the mayor's race in particular, and you see the rise of Andrew Cuomo, who is essentially saying, I'm not an ideologue. I'm just going to try to get things done. And you see in New York City, as you see around the country, kind of on a mass level, moving away from the progressive ideology that has kind of driven a lot of stuff on the Democratic side.
Well, there's two very interesting trends going on at once in the election, right? I mean, you certainly, and there's a reality to this, as we're alluding to in the federal context, right? We're about to face a very difficult funding situation that's going to filter down to the state level and to the city level, and we'll have some very tough choices to make. I don't think anyone has illusions about that. So that sort of favors, Cuomo sort of made it his brand when he was governor about how he was going to get costs under control. Everything would be capped at, only a 2% this increase, that. He had all kinds of techniques and tools and bullying that he would sometimes use to accomplish that. So certainly that might favor Cuomo politically. But you also, of course, see the rise of candidates. I mean, speaking of other polls, aside from the one we're discussing, you have Zohran Mamdani, who is a socialist from Queens, a state assembly member, who is talking about, first of all, freezing rents, right, just right off the bat. He's, I think his specifics on public housing and other sort of aspects of, talking about things that would be very expensive to fund, but he has quite a serious intention, I think, of getting government to invest more.
Right, but you and I watch that stuff pretty closely. Zohran Mamdani, who's a very smart and interesting guy, comes out of the Democratic Socialists of America, the DSA wing, which has been successful in small community elections, in legislative elections, in council elections. They have not been able to show strength beyond those kind of local areas. Arguably, Mamdani in one poll was near 30%. That may be a reflection of their organizational strength, but that doesn't get the second votes to be able to move on.
Right, and you're alluding to ranked choice voting, of course, and I think it'll be interesting. I think Mamdani has his own qualities. Just personally, he's very charismatic. I think certainly the DSA membership has some wind at his back. And look, it's early yet, right? We're
very early.
Taping this in late March, and the primary election is in June, right? So a lot can change.
You mean the election isn't?
Well, we'll see.
I don't know if, I wouldn't say that this year.
Yeah, this year could be very different.
Yep.
But look, I overall do think that, voters are clearly, the national situation and their frustrations locally are combining to create obviously very frustrated voters who are ready for change. And so it's a question, I think Cuomo, he has name recognition and a voting history with New Yorkers that is obviously unmatched, but people are also, because they're looking for change, might be, especially with this economic distress, looking for someone who is offering solutions.
Let me, I do want to switch for a second to public safety because we're talking about Andrew Cuomo. I mean, Andrew Cuomo signed the bail reform law into law, which I believe, whatever my own politics, just as a political analysis, had a lot to do with, as the rest of the country moved to the left in the 2018 elections, we moved to the right. We elected a number of Republican congresspeople. And one of the issues, I believe, was this perception of what the bail reform law, taking away judicial discretion. In 2024, country moves to the right, we move back to the left. Where Democrats took back some of those seats. This is a perception and reality question. How strong is the perception? Why does the perception of crime stand so more strongly than some of the statistics? That's a tough question to ask you. I'm not sure.
Right.
Put on your reporter hat.
Okay. I'll wear both hats simultaneously. I think that, and I can tie this back into the poll because one of the things we really wanted to get at was, obviously we were not, surveying New Yorker. We have crime stats that are, put out by the NYPD. We asked some questions about whether people who were taking the survey, whether they or someone they know had been a victim of a crime or had witnessed a crime.
My car was stolen, by the way, but that's a
Bob.
separate.
Okay, well,
Wow.
it is, and I think I just speak personally, anecdotally. Part of the reason we developed that question was because when all of our partners were meeting and working together on the survey, you know, many of us, even if we had not been a victim directly of a crime in recent years ourselves, many more of us had either witnessed something criminal happen or knew someone personally who had been a victim. And so there was this sort of deeper ripple effect that felt like it was happening in the city in a way that was different from, you know, 5, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. So we were trying to get at that piece of it. And I think that's where some of the crime statistics are limited, right? I mean, we talk about crime on the subway, which thankfully the stats show is improving from a public safety standpoint. But we had a number of high-profile crimes, even if you didn't witness them. There was
But that's also linked into the mental health.
randomness,
That's also linked into
randomness
mental health.
to them and the mental health crisis that led many New Yorkers to experience a sense of deep unease or best case scenario, right, or outright fear and concern about using the public transportation system. So I think all of those things have led to public safety concerns continuing to loom large. For me personally, I've been really heartened by what we're seeing when we look at the stats, the trends. I think we're starting to move in the right direction, but it takes a lot longer to change the perception that people feel. I rode the subway last night. I was on at 11:30 p.m. and I was traveling with my husband, and we commented about how full the subway was and how wonderful that was. We had seen a show. We were riding back from Times Square back to Brooklyn, and the subway was bustling at 11:30 p.m. That felt like a new thing to be on a subway that was crowded at night on a Wednesday night. And I think that's good, speaks well to the health of the city. And for, you know, I feel like it becomes a snowball effect. You have a ride like that that's uneventful, feels very full. I might, you know, ride the subway home by myself at 11:30 p.m. in a way that I haven't felt comfortable doing maybe in the last few years.
Tell us your name and your campus.
My name is Chidi Adiemi, my pronouns are they, them, and I go to the CUNY Graduate School of Public Health. My question is, how do we deal with being in a housing crisis while some units remain empty due to landlords not wishing to lower rents?
Well, some of those units are empty precisely because of the lack of maintenance that you were talking about, I think, also.
Yeah, some units are certainly vacant because of needing landlord investment, but I think that becomes like
Including in Nycha.
And Nycha's working quite hard to try to rehab those vacant units to try to move that over. But I think there's a broader concern and issue around the commodification of housing and the warehousing of units that is happening not just across New York City, but really across cities across the U.S. And I think when we take a step back and think about the housing crisis, especially in recent years, as the discourse has sort of shifted it towards a supply and demand housing shortage kind of frame, there's a lot that gets built that, to the question we just heard, it's sitting vacant. And so if our ideology, if our political mission is just to build and there's no nuance beyond that, we get luxury towers like are in downtown Brooklyn that are primarily empty of multi-million-dollar condos that haven't sold.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think one policy solution that we heard a lot about before the pandemic, but has kind of not been in the mix lately, is, you know, the idea of a pied-à-terre tax, right? That there are apartments that they may not be vacant, someone may occupy it for a few weeks a year, and they, you know, they may not benefit from certain tax breaks, but they also don't have any penalty for that. And I think that was an idea that was actively discussed before the pandemic.
There's, you know, I don't know if it's a subtext or a context or what. This raises the question of gentrification. Of, you know, you have these market rate units, some of which are not even being occupied, and there is a perception in the poll of gentrification, and that is driving. You know, you're taking apartments away that people who grew up in a neighborhood now can no longer afford. So, I mean, how much of a concern is that? I mean, the poll showed a significant percentage of people concerned about.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so glad James said that, because I feel like that is not part of the narrative enough, that there is inventory, there is housing here, but the idea that it all has to go for market has left much of it empty. And I think that it is really playing a role in people not being able to find affordable housing. I grew up in Flatbush. I could not buy my house today in Bedford-Stuyvesant that I live in. And that means my children could not buy that house, right? My sons could not afford to live in the community that they grew up in. They grew up in Bed-Stuy. I grew up in Flatbush. And there's a problem there, that there's not affordable housing for folks to live in the communities where they went through the roughest times, and they can't live in that neighborhood. And I do think that that would be a wonderful policy for, you know, all the foreign nationals that have homes here and don't use them. But there's also needs to be something about building housing and not making it truly affordable, or not making it available to people who need that housing. I struggle with data in general and like these stats, and you know, we talk about the unemployment stat. I think that once someone has been unemployed, and we know this for a period of time, and they get off of unemployment, we're no longer counting them. So all the people that have been unemployed or chronically unemployed for a really long time, they're not being counted there. And safety is not only, are you safe from crime? I also feel unsafe when someone is struggling with mental health issues on the subway. So I think that this perception and this idea of safety is something that we have to look at differently, and that so many people were disconnected from their treatments during COVID and never were reconnected in a real way. So that's why nonprofits are so important, because they're the stabilization for these folks and bring more safety and makes it so that we feel more comfortable being on the subways.
Can I jump in on something Jocelynne said? Because one of the things that we were really proud is the wrong word, but one of the things that was affirming to us in the results was a question that we had asked around how they feel when they see someone who is experiencing a mental health crisis. And we gave people two options. One was around having an empathetic reaction when they see someone who's in need and not getting the help that they want. And the other was also just, do you feel more like, this is frustrating, I'm trying to go about my day, why do I have to deal with this kind of thing? We thought very carefully about the language to make it a fair set of choices, and New Yorkers overwhelmingly said they feel empathy. You know, I think for many people who are struggling, they might see themselves as being only one or a few steps away from experiencing serious housing insecurity or a mental health challenge that blows up in their face. And so, and we saw that reflected too in a question that we asked about the types of interventions that people want to see on the subway to deal with severe mental health challenges. And the number one response had to do with, more mental health services and housing for people who are dealing with severe mental health challenges. So New Yorkers know we have a problem, but they want to see some real long-term solutions.
Support.
Tell us your name and the campus, please.
Hi, my name's Louisa Opdyke. I attend School of Labor and Urban Studies. Just to follow up on the housing issue, maybe this is for Professor Rodriguez. I was wondering if you could speak to social housing legislation, possibly reassessing AMI, which is a big problem, and
AMI is area median income, which in New York includes the suburbs, so it's a very high number. So you'd say 80% of AMI. That's still out of reach of a lot of people. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
and also maybe reassessing property taxes, which are extremely inequitable and leaves a lot of money on the table for the city, which could go to capital.
You're up, Professor.
Yeah, Louisa, it's a great question. Thank you. And I think Alyssa was bringing up similar points. And I think to me, the broader issue is that there is a lot of creative policy making, I think, that we haven't really quite touched that can do a lot to address the existing housing crisis and funding housing programs that are critically in need of those. And I think changes to the AMI is certainly one that is probably very long overdue. I think different community groups for a while now have been championing a neighborhood
median income.
a neighborhood median income, right? To Bob's point, something that will actually encompass community members rather than a sort of large amorphous group of New Yorkers. And one thing I really enjoyed about this survey is the pieces of that survey, they break things down by borough. Because yes, we're all New Yorkers and we have a certain kind of common experience, but also life in Manhattan is really different from life in the South Bronx. And AMI is one of those things that will completely obliterate that. And I heard Jocelynne's point earlier talking about truly affordable housing. And that's not an uncommon phrase to hear in housing circles or housing debates in New York City, right? Truly affordable. And if we take a step back, part of that is because we do have really comprehensive affordable housing policy that for many folks is not affordable. And so we have to stipulate and we have to qualify truly affordable housing or housing that's going to be affordable to local community members.
That's at 50% of AMI as opposed to 80.
And I just want to also, note that just for our viewers that on property taxes, that actually rental housing is taxed pretty much more than any other kind of housing because politically it's much, you get votes by protecting homeowners from property tax increases. And so in fact, we're taxing the kind of housing that should be the most affordable, that working people depend on more than others, and that's one of many inequities that needs to be addressed.
If you pay your property tax through your rent, you don't see it. You don't have it broken out. You don't feel that. One of the because of the absence of a pot of money in which to build truly affordable housing, and you see this in the city of Yes and in other plans, is the idea of developments with both market rate and affordable housing, and the market rate cross-subsidizes, cross-subsidizes the affordable units, assuming that they're at an affordability level that, real people can afford. That's a little different than what you're talking about in terms of flat out figuring out a way to raise bonds or however you do it to build fully affordable developments. Is that correct?
That's correct. And I think one of the issues with a model that is premised on a market rate component, and especially in our current climate where that is pretty much the de facto housing policy, as we've noted, we don't really see any kind of expansion or even investment of maintaining public housing. What happens is the viability of a project, the creation of a development is now actually predicated on how profitable it is for a developer. That is the first and last criteria that's going to determine what gets built and how gets and what time frame and where and when.
Except that the city does try to temper that with all kinds of mandatory inclusionary zoning aspects.
Certainly.
It's not as if the city says just go build whatever you want wherever you want. I mean, the city does try to temper that.
Certainly. It does try to temper that, but I think that the primary motive is still the onus is on the developers, right? And I think that when that is kind of the only model that exists, we start to create a roiling housing crisis that, as we've heard, is one that isn't really new, has been facing New Yorkers for decades, but has been growing, and one that is now growing across more and more economic spheres or economic categories.
It would be if you look at we're also electing a comptroller. We're not just electing a mayor. And I believe both of the major comptroller candidates, Mark Levine, the Manhattan Borough President, Justin Brannon, who is on the city council and is the council finance chair, are looking into how you can use public pension funds in order to, provided you are going to keep those pension funds whole. I mean, you can't just spend the money and take it away from the retirees that it's committed to, but that's
and I should add Brad Lander, who is the current comptroller who's running for mayor. He is also promoting similar policies now. I mean, he says he'll expand on that.
Because they're looking for pots of money.
That's right. Well, and also because, you have in the union pension funds a willing partner. I mean, it's very, I think that it's both, good for affordable housing. It's also good for those union members who will have access to that housing. It's a win-win.
Because one of the ideas of what's called, you know, we talk about affordable housing. Another term that's often used is workforce housing.
Right.
And, you know, the idea is that, you know, even if you're going to have all these wealthy people, you need people to serve them. You know, you need people to do the
Yes,
work.
yeah.
So,
Yep.
I mean, that's, you know, and Brooklyn has always been a workforce
You need-
housing center.
Exactly. And New York City is a city of small businesses, right? And so we always have to think about how we're supporting small businesses and the workers in small businesses. Are they being paid? Because we all like our
Well, and where
neighborhood
they can
restaurant.
afford to live.
Exactly, that they're living close by. So, and we also need to think about that for our public servants as well. Can they live in the city as well? And they can't. And that means that they don't understand the Nycha housing. They don't know those people because they don't live with those people because they can't even afford to live in our city. And I think that it's just so complicated and so much to think about because it's not just affordability. It's affordability, but it's affordability on a lot of different levels.
Yes, ma'am. Tell us your name and your campus, please.
Hello, my name is Melanie Munoz and I attend Lehman College. My question is, do you think that the state and the city are doing an efficient job at helping people get out of public housing, and for that matter, any other type of public assistance? Or do you think that more efficient strategies should be implemented to ensure that people do not need to rely on those services for an indefinite period of time?
You know, what that is, you know, if I could, you know, kind of rephrase it, is that, you know, the traditional economic argument is a rising tide lifts all boats. And, you know, presumably if it lifts the boats enough, you don't need the kinds of public services. You know, that's one of the reasons that we've seen the push to raise the minimum wage. And is there any likelihood of that going forward?
I mean, I think that one challenge that's been perpetual with public benefits is what's known as the benefits cliff, right? That your income rises, but then suddenly your effective income just collapses because you suddenly lose food stamps, you lose your housing assistance, you lose the benefits that your family relies on.
Health
Healthcare
coverage.
being a very, very, very important one. And so I think that, you know, I think other panelists can speak more to specifics, but I do think that dealing with that benefits cliff is and childcare, which all candidates for mayor are really coming out with platforms on, because again, like other than families within a particular low-income band who can qualify for childcare assistance, for anyone else it's just astronomically expensive, and really bringing those benefits closer to the lower middle class and middle class is essential.
And we're moving, like on childcare, Five Borough Institute has done a lot of work around childcare and working toward a universal childcare system. And you know, we have seen the cost of childcare just skyrocket in recent years. So we're not seeing a diminishment of the universe of people that are looking for subsidized care. We're seeing explosive growth. And the way many of these benefits are structured, it's designed, frankly, to keep people out. It's shockingly and frankly outrageously difficult for families who are eligible for subsidized childcare to actually access it. And that's part of the reason why we have so few families that are taking advantage of it, because we've created so many bureaucratic hurdles that have to be cleared in order to get that care that's needed, and which allows you to be in the workforce and hold down a full-time job. So we've really been coming at that, at the child care issue from an economic development standpoint. This is an issue that all New Yorkers should care about, not only ones that have very young children, because it impacts our economy. And as we saw with universal pre-K, when you create a truly universal program that is as straightforward to get your kid into as signing up, you know, on the NYC Department of Education website, we think childcare should operate very much in a similar way, that there are not 100 hoops that you have to jump through. You can get either free or very affordable care for all New Yorkers.
Well, childcare is an economic development issue. Frankly, just as immigration is. I mean, immigration is, you know,
And a workforce development.
As a New Yorker, it's also a spiritual issue.
It is.
But it's if you deport all these people, who are going to? I mean, Florida is now looking to lift child labor laws, so that you know, teenagers can now do the work that the undocumented workers have been doing. So I mean, these are all at some point economic issues.
And to the broader issue of those economic concerns, and to the other component of the question around public housing being sort of a transitionary kind of role, I think that there's also sometimes a little bit of like a reframe narrative around that, because if we look at some of the origins of public housing, it wasn't actually like we're going to build something temporary. It was about building something that would be distinct and a market improvement over private sector tenement slums, essentially.
Yes.
And so this was the city, the state, and the federal government sort of uniting and recognizing that private sector housing has essentially failed the working class with really deeply insufficient and unsafe housing, and then public housing was built as a model outside and apart from that. And I think that somewhere along the line, we've more broadly looked at public housing and other forms of public assistance as this should be a transitionary, temporary thing, and then also frame some of our politics around how do we either make things more difficult for folks to either access or maintain their benefits, or how do we shuffle folks out of this program when there historically or today has never been a greater need for truly affordable housing in the city.
Yes, ma'am. Your name and your campus, please.
Hi, my name is Kayla Strayhorn, and I go to Baruch College. I wanted to know, in your respective fields, have you seen aspects of the affordability crisis that could be symptoms of like post-COVID policy?
Very interesting questions.
I mean, I think I was speaking to some of this before about like when I say that there are apartments that are only occupied part of the time. I mean, many people have moved to country homes, other countries, they're digital nomads. I mean, I think our housing is being consumed very differently than it was before COVID. And I think we haven't really reckoned with, we don't even really have the data. It's one thing that I've been working on with my team is to figure out how do we even track this when, the Housing and Vacancy Survey, which is the gold standard from the US Census and our city housing agency, tracks vacancies just based on is someone living there, is someone not, is it a vacation home? And the world is so much more complex now in terms of where people are at any given moment.
Also, but the other point is that because of the massive amount of work from home for office workers, and which had an obvious and instant effect on the retail industry throughout the city, and that retail industry, small mom and pop shops who basically support a workforce that allows the city to make it. We're not fully back to 100% in office work, but this is more than a ripple. This is a tidal wave of impact.
Yep. And so many people remain out of work, and so many businesses remain closed after COVID. And I also I'm going back to, the cost, the high cost of goods. That all began during COVID, right? Remember when everything was stopped? And that is still impacting us today. So I think that a lot of this is due to what happened during COVID. But I also think that there's so many things that are coming from this administration that is going to continue.
This Washington administration.
Exactly, from this Washington administration that is going to continue to escalate this, and that we really have to pay close attention because, this affordability issue is not going to go away and folks aren't going to care.
Well, I think that this election of Trump was essentially a cultural election, kind of a restoration of some mythic 1950s America. And, one of the points of New York City is that everybody's a minority. There is no majority. If you're looking at this demographically, ethnically, racially, religiously, however you want to look at it, there is no majority. And the country is moving in that direction as well. And, I think that's a strength. There are a lot of people who don't think that's a strength. And that's why I think this collision, we're not done with this collision yet. So
not at all.
No, I mean, one thing that we have from the federal administration in Washington standpoint that we have our eyes on are obviously the potential deep budget cuts to the city and the state. But New York City, we're here at CUNY. New York City is home to just a vast number of universities, higher education institutions. And we sometimes say, or I think it was Mayor Bloomberg who used to say, we have more college students in New York City than there are people in Boston. Just to put a point on just how much higher ed is part of our ecosystem in New York. And we know that there are so many federal cuts that are targeting higher education. And that's also going to have just a huge impact on the economy, the well-being of so many people and the future of New York to continue to attract students, professors, researchers, all of those things.
You also see that, and this goes back to some of the things you looked at in the report. You can see those cuts coming down the turnpike. This is a mixed metaphor. Coming down the turnpike at mass transit.
Yep.
And if there's any lifeblood in keeping this city moving, and those are the capillaries that keep us alive. So.
Oh, yeah, that's deeply concerning. I mean, we just did an event with Jano Lieber, who's the chairman of the MTA, who's out trying to build support for the MTA's $60+ billion capital program. To say nothing of the threats to congestion pricing right now, and it's deeply concerning. The funding needs are significant for the MTA. That's just to keep the system in a state of good repair so that we don't descend back into that so-called summer of hell. I forgot exactly what year the summer of hell was, but where there was just mass disruption to the subway system. It feels like we are finally starting to turn a corner on kind of subway ridership going up, all of these things, more people going back to the office. But that is hugely distressing and really looms large as a deep funding cut to New York.
We have about 45 seconds left. Because we're in an election year, this is just kind of an academic question. Do surveys like what they did, do they inform journalists? Do they inform policymakers?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think it's such a breath of fresh air to have a survey that is not of voters or likely voters, that is just of the people of New York, and the level at which this survey got deep into what New Yorkers thought and felt. And I thought that was very important, what you said about the empathy that the survey showed on a number of fronts. It told us who New Yorkers are and who we are writing for. So I think that was incredibly important.
Thank you. We're running out of time. Thank you for joining us on CUNY Forum. We'll see you next time.